I'm Cliff Ribner, and I'm going to talk to you today about why America has not won a single war since World War II. It's been an obvious fact. We've had war after war. And they go on forever. And America has never been more overwhelmingly, hegemonically powerful in the world. Throughout the time after beginning in World War II, we were the first ones to have nuclear weapons. You know how we won the war in Japan? We threatened to use more of them. And the only thing you have to do with nuclear weapons, the way you use them, is have them in your arsenal. After Nagasaki and Hiroshima, that's all you have to do with them. You don't have to explode them and kill people. You simply have to have lots of them, and lots more than anyone else. And that was exactly the position we were in after 1945. We were the only ones in the world with nuclear weapons. We forced the Japanese, who had taken thousands and thousands of our soldiers' lives in the war in the Pacific, and were ready to do it again. They were ready to have these kamikaze fighters use their planes these were the equivalent of drones, except real live people were in there. They were terribly dangerous, and they did huge damage, and they were ready to use all that. And they were fanatics. They were complete fanatics. But we forced their surrender when we showed them what nuclear weapons could do. And it's terrible what happened to those citizens of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, but that's how you win wars. We won the war in Germany. We firebombed their cities, and it was just massive casualties. We can't even imagine the massive amount of destruction. The cities of Hamburg and Frankfurt were practically flattened, and Dresden was firebombed. That's how you win wars. You have to force the enemy to realize that it's hopeless for them and completely demoralize them. That's the only way wars have ever been won, and there's nothing new about this. This has been true throughout history. Anyway, in order to understand what's been going on since World War II, we have to go back to the 19th century and the British Empire. Why the British Empire eventually collapsed, even though it was beneficial to all the members of it. Britain did not force any of those countries into the British Empire. They joined voluntarily because Britain gave them the benefit of a free market, and it gave them the common law, the law of free men, which we have. The entire English-speaking world has it. It was the best thing that ever happened to all of the countries in the British Empire. And after the British left, are all those colonies sitting around hating Britain? No, most of them are still in the British Commonwealth. In India was a special case. India was a country that became completely anglicized. Other European countries had wanted to establish colonies there, and the Indians picked the British. And they picked the British over the other Europeans because the British offered them a better trading deal. That's literally what it was. The East India Company conquered India without firing a shot. England is so much tinier than India, and India at that time in the 17th century or the 18th century, it was not just present-day India. It was India, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nepal. It was huge. And all of them wanted to be part of the British Empire because being in the British Empire meant the end. The British insisted that they stop doing things like having wars among the kingdoms there. India was a bunch of different little kingdoms. I mean, they weren't so little. These kingdoms, most of them were bigger than England. Countries, what are now states in the present state of India, they were entire kingdoms, and they each had their own king. And what happened was, Marxism picked, during the 19th century, communists came up with a brilliant strategy of using front movements to promote communism, because communism itself is not something anyone would ever want to pick for themselves. It's the abolition of all private property. It's insane. And we've seen, of course, in the history of all the communist countries in the world, they become impoverished and there's no freedom whatsoever. and they never get anywhere. All the cars in Cuba today are the same cars that were there when Castro took over. They're these 1950s model Chevrolets and Fords, and the rich people have Cadillacs. But that's all they have. There's been no advancement whatsoever of the economy in Cuba the entire time since Castro took over. And you can't understand what our presidents have been doing without understanding the extent to which they bought in to the communist front movement of anti-colonialism. Anti-colonialism is one of these things that it sounds very nice. Doesn't it sound nice, freeing people from colonial rule? Well, the reality is whether the people in a colony are free or not has nothing to do with whether it's a colony. No place on the world was more free for the citizens than Hong Kong when the British had it as part of the British Empire. And Hong Kong people didn't get to vote for anybody. The English appointed whoever was in charge there, but they were the freest place on the planet. They had their own currency, and they didn't let inflation happen to it. They were absolutely free, but they had no democracy whatsoever. Democracy is no guarantee of liberty. And in fact, in the past, democracies have all become tyrannies. The only difference is that the people all vote for it. But the benefit of democracy, of course, is the control over who gets elected, but only if there are procedures which make sure that the democratic control really reflects the interests of the people. That's what our founders had to deal with when they created this country, was figuring out a way to have the freest system possible, what they called a democratic republic, and that's what it is, where, yes, nobody gets into office unless the people have elected them, but the nature of the offices is such that the offices are not permitted to be tyrants. That's the important thing. You can have a democracy where all you do is elect another tyrant. So what freedom is there then? Anyway, anti-colonialism was a communist front movement that started in the 19th century and was adopted by the British upper class. It's really crazy. They had this empire which benefited everyone all over the world. What happened was the British school system is such, they have what's called public schools. They actually are the opposite of what it sounds like. The public schools are where rich people, they were the equivalent of prep schools in America. Anyway, that's where the upper classes of Britain went to be instructed. And that's also where the upper classes of India went. They had similar system in India. In fact, the Indian schools, India was so anglicized, their schools were just like the British schools. So in India, you had this campaign, which was also going on, pushing this idea that colonialism is evil and that Marxism is good. They really bought into that. And what's called Fabian socialism. Anyway, as the British upper classes came to hate their own country because they saw it as as a pro-colonial empire, even though the nature of the colonies was such that they wanted to be in it because they benefited, because it was really a trade union. That's really what it amounted to. Yes, they had to pay some taxes to the British, but that was a trivial part of it. That wasn't the way. It didn't cost them any more in taxes than they would have paid if the British weren't there at all. People always end up paying taxes. But what happened was the British kept the existing rulers in each of those countries. The kings of each of the countries in India remained the king. And the British didn't interfere with that, except they did insist that the common law be used so that they have courts of law applying the common law. And they also insisted that certain practices be banned, like wife burning. They said you can't do that anymore. You can't burn your wife when she's a widow just because the husband died. So they did things like that. But the Indians appreciated it until the 19th century. This had been going on since the 16th century. That's really when the East India Company went in there. Anyway, and as I have said in other videos, the French, the Dutch, and the Danes had all tried, and the Portuguese had all tried to establish colonies in India, but the Indians wanted to be part of the British Empire. And the worst thing that happened to all of the former British colonies in Africa in particular is when the British left. They've all been a mess ever since, which is what they were before. That's why they were happy that the British made them colonies. And the reason the British eventually had to quit was because they weren't making money on the whole thing. It was costing them a fortune, and they had destroyed themselves in the World War I and World War II, and they literally couldn't afford the financial drain of the empire. That's why they ended it. That's the real reason. It wasn't because they were, quote unquote, liberating people. Anyway, Marxists came up with this brilliant propaganda approach called anti-colonialism in the 19th century, and it infested the British upper classes, who came to have, they lost all support, or they became hostile to, self-hating about their own empire. That's really what it amounted to. And in America, of course, we never had an empire. But our presidents after World War II were actually embarrassed by our power. That's why we got into the UN in the first place and created it. We were overwhelmingly the only superpower in the world. We were the only ones with nuclear weapons. And so we had the ability, with any country we wanted to demand surrender from, to demand surrender, the way we did with the Japanese. And no one could have been a more fanatic enemy of ours than the Japanese were in 1945. Anyway, at Potsdam and Yalta, and we had this problem in America of having the State Department. Joseph McCarthy was not wrong that the State Department was filled with communists. Alger Hiss was a real communist, and he was a major player both in the State Department and in advising presidents. And our presidents, FDR and Truman, were embarrassed by America's power. At Potsdam and Yalta, they gave the Soviets an effective control. The whole reason there was a North Korea and a North Vietnam, instead of just Korea and Vietnam that were part of our universe, was because it was given to the Soviet Union. We didn't have to have a Korean War at all. And in fact, the reason the Korean War started, the real reason, was the State Department put out a notice, and the Secretary of State told the world at a conference that South Korea was outside of our zone of protection, basically giving a green light to the Chinese to invade South Korea. That's literally what happened. So it was our own State Department that created the whole Korean War in the first place. But at the time of the Korean War, when that started under Truman, we could have won it the same way we won the war in Japan. We had all the nukes. Nobody else did. And yet they refused to threaten the use of those nukes. It was like it was off limits. They came up with this stupid idea of containment. They thought they were these great, brave, cold warriors. But all they were interested in surrendering our power. And this came up multiple times. In 1956, Nasser, who was a communist and an anti-colonialist, he became president of in Egypt, and he stole the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal was owned by the French and British, or actually by a corporation, which was French and British. Egypt had been part of the world where actually all of the Middle East had been previously owned by the British and the French. But the French and the British, French and British companies still own the Suez Canal. Well, Nasser attacked it. He decided he was going to nationalize it in the name of anti-colonialism. He was going to steal it from that company. And the British and the French and the Israelis didn't want to put up with that at all. And they were ready to oppose it. In fact, the Israelis started to. And instead of supporting our allies, Eisenhower stabbed them in the back and supported Nasser and the USSR, making Nasser look like a big hero in that part of the world. because he basically gave the green light to Nasser to steal the Suez Canal from the French and the British. That's just one example. He did the same thing with Cuba. Cuba, he permitted Castro to take over. Cuba had previously been it was a colony of America at one time. We won the Spanish-American War. So there was a corrupt dictatorship there, but they weren't communists. And everybody knew Castro was a communist. Castro denied it, but you'd have to be an idiot not to know it. It was Mao denied he was a communist also in China. Anyway, Eisenhower, the great victor of World War II, who actually is nothing but a bureaucrat and a Republican to boot, he permitted that to happen. And then Kennedy, when Khrushchev, first of all, under Eisenhower, they had come up with a plan to invade Cuba, which wouldn't have been necessary if Eisenhower had simply stopped the communists from taking over, which we could easily have done. There's no question we had the power to do it. Castro's military was a joke compared to ours. It wouldn't have taken anything to stop it. Anyway, the Bay of Pigs, which is now called the Bay of Pigs fiasco, was a plan that the CIA came up with of having emigres from Cuba attack Cuba and then attack the communists. And Kennedy basically pulled the rug out from under them. He refused to support them and let them all be massacred. And when Khrushchev saw that, he knew that Kennedy was a patsy. So he put those, and what the one thing, the USSR had two goals in dealing with Cuba. They wanted it to be a front for them, and they wanted the U.S. to get missiles out of Turkey, which we had there, and they also wanted to end the Monroe Doctrine. Under the Monroe Doctrine, our enemies are not supposed to have footholds in this part of the world, and that's what a communist country is. It's a violation of the Monroe Doctrine. And what Kennedy did, he's presented by this adoring press as this great Cold Warrior who did this great nuclear standoff. At the time that happened, this is hard to believe, we had almost 30,000 nuclear weapons. I think it was 25,000 when Kennedy was president. And the Soviets had nothing. They could not have engaged in a nuclear war with us. It would have been over in 5 minutes. Even if they attempted to strike us, we had overwhelming first, second, and third strike capability. And by the way, we had that right up until Reagan, or actually until Nixon started giving it away. But we had that throughout the entire Vietnam War. We had when Johnson was president, we had 31,000 nukes. The Russians had about 4,000. That's the way you use nuclear weapons. You don't drop them after Nagasaki and Hiroshima. You just have them. And you tell the enemy credibly, if you don't do what we want you to do, we're going to hit your cities and wipe them out. And we're going to take out all your weapons as well. That's all we had to do. We didn't have to lose a single soldier in Vietnam. Neither Kennedy nor Johnson were willing to do that. And by the way, Kennedy permitted the Vietnam War to become unwinnable by us. Because what happened was when Kennedy was president, and by the way, we had already committed to Vietnam. The French had been there previously. Eisenhower had put some money and soldiers into it. He refused to fight it. But when Kennedy was president, the North Vietnamese army began infiltrating South Vietnam through the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was in Laos and Cambodia. And the CIA told Kennedy about this and told him we can stop it immediately by bombing it. And Kennedy said no. Kennedy permitted South Vietnam to be infiltrated by the North Vietnamese army, which they called the Viet Cong. And they were there. It became a guerrilla war because that's what happens when the enemy's army is able to infiltrate all the villages and terrify all the villagers. And none of them, of course, were in uniform. That's what we had to contend with in Vietnam. And then in the wars after that, the United States has simply been unwilling to recognize its strategic interests in winning the war and just letting it be, letting the people elect whatever they wanted as long as we had air supremacy in that part of the world. We could have done that in Iraq after we won that war in about 10 minutes. That's all we had to do, was simply take over the Air Force and establish our supremacy and prevent Iran from turning Iraq into a colony, which is what they've done since then. Same thing in Afghanistan. We had overwhelming air superiority. We built the Bagram airport, which Biden gave away. It cost billions of dollars. That airport and the planes that we supplied the Afghan military and the Afghan Air Force, that is, as it existed at the time, with 1,800 special operations guys there. We didn't lose a single one for the last 18 months of that war. And we wouldn't have. We could have just kept 1,800 special operations guys there, controlling the Afghan Air Force, which would have given us complete air supremacy for thousands of miles away. And instead, that ended up being given to the communist Chinese. Anyway, this is just a brief recital of some of the terrible things our presidents have done to us since World War II. By refusing to recognize America's real interests, by running away from the fact that we were, in fact, the hegemon, but we have nothing but good intentions everywhere, and by trying to colonize. We were really, in our anti-colonialism, we were trying to colonize in Vietnam and Afghanistan, trying to make them turn into republics like what we wanted, when it was totally unnecessary. We could have let them elect whoever they want to elect, and just have our own strategic interests represented by military control of the area. I'm Cliff Ribner, and if you like what I have to say, let people know about my videos, like this video, and read my stuff at my website, cliffordribner.com, and buy my book, Freedom's Last Stand. Thank you.